I was running a late sample when the building came apart. That is the plain version of how it started, and it is the accurate one. Not heroism, not instinct, not any particular quality of character. I was in the sublevel because Professor Orenth had given me a make-up window to finish my compressive stress readings after I had missed the lab session the week before, and the university's deep archive level was the quietest place on campus to run long samples without interference from the surface vibration of the transit corridors overhead. Compact University Kethvorel had 3 sublevels beneath the main academic building. The survey lab occupied sublevel 2. The deep archive occupied sublevel 3, directly below. I had been there for 2 hours and 40 minutes when the floor shook. I had felt building vibrations before. Every geology student has. You learn early to distinguish the signature of transit passage from the signature of mechanical fault from the signature of something worse, and what I felt at 21:47 on the 14th day of the 3rd academic term was not any of the first 2. It was a sharp frequency percussion followed by a sustained low frequency roll, the kind that means something structural has been cut, not just stressed. My sample reader clattered off the bench. The overhead light panel flickered twice and went out. The emergency strips along the floor came on in pale amber, and in that amber light I watched a crack propagate across the ceiling from west to east in about 4 seconds, which is faster than a crack should travel through grade B composite if the load is natural. I did not run. That is not bravery. Running in a building that is telling you it has just lost a load-bearing element is how people die in sublevels. You run into the wrong space and you find out what the building has decided to do with its weight. I stood still, listened, and counted. The secondary groan came at 11 seconds, north face below me, which meant sublevel 3 had taken the primary hit, the deep archive. I thought for exactly 1 moment about the evacuation protocol: go up, go out, meet at the South Courtyard Assembly Point. And then I thought about what I had seen 3 months ago in my second week on campus. She took the same route through the sublevel every Tuesday and Thursday evening. I had noticed because the deep archive closed at 2100, and she always arrived at 2045. Which was cutting it closer than most of the graduate students did, and because she moved through the corridors the way people move when they are used to being watched and have learned to make themselves small to avoid it. I am from Compact Survey Division stock. My parents both did frontier postings, and I had spent enough time on joint compact stations to recognize an alien exchange student on a placement she had not chosen. Pointed ears, teal-green skin that went darker at the jaw. Indigo hair worn close, no styling to it, the kind of plainness that is deliberate rather than careless. Eyes that were pale gold and registered everything they landed on, quickly and completely, in the manner of someone who has learned that information is most useful when gathered before the other person notices you are gathering it. I had never spoken to her. She was not enrolled in any of my seminars. I did not even know her name until I heard a Velorath court attendant call her Vitha in the transit corridor once, 3 weeks in a tone that meant the name was being used as a direction rather than a greeting. The attendant was a compact figure in formal Velorath traveling attire who walked 2 steps behind her at all times and whose presence was, by everything in the person's bearing, not a courtesy. She had been in the deep archive tonight. I had passed the entrance at 2043 and seen the access light green. I picked up my survey kit, cable light, contact sensor, field notebook, water canteen, and I went down. Sublevel 3 had a single stairwell access from sublevel 2 at the north end of the corridor. The door was buckled but not sealed. I got it open with my shoulder and a sustained push, which told me the frame had torqued but the locking mechanism was still disengaged, which meant the power had not fully cut. The emergency strips here were dimmer, 1 in 3 functioning, and the air smelled of particulate and something sharp, chemical, not stone. Composite dust has a mineral smell, chalky and dry. This had a sharp edge underneath it, acrid, the kind of chemical signature that comes from a device rather than a mechanical failure. I noted it and kept moving. I moved down the stairwell carefully, testing each tread before committing weight. The bottom landing had shifted. The northeast corner had dropped approximately 30 centimeters, which told me the footing on that side had failed. I stepped around it and moved into the corridor. The air was thicker here, heavier with particulate, and the temperature had dropped several degrees. Sublevel 3 was older construction than the survey lab above, built before the compact renovation cycle that had brought the upper levels up to current standard, and the older construction had less tolerance for load redistribution. That made it more vulnerable to a targeted device. That also made it more predictable if you knew how to read it. The deep archive ran the full east-west length of sublevel 3, with reading alcoves off both sides and a main stack section at the west end. The ceiling was lower here than in the survey lab, older construction, pre-compact renovation specifications, tighter tolerances, and 3 of the ceiling panels had come down across the corridor in a loose field of debris. None of the emergency strips were functioning. I turned on my cable light, which runs a broad diffuse beam useful for surveying in enclosed spaces, and swept it across the floor. The debris field was not random. The panels had fallen in a pattern that said the ceiling had failed at a specific point, approximately 8 meters west of the stairwell, where there was a juncture column, and the failure had propagated both ways from there, which meant the column had been the target. I was standing in a building that had been damaged deliberately, and I did not spend time on what that meant for the larger situation because there was a more immediate question. I called out. Not loudly, acoustics in partially collapsed spaces can transmit sound further than you expect, and if there was further unstable material overhead, I did not want to generate vibration. I have had it explained to me since, by people with more dramatic sensibilities, that descending into a deliberately damaged sublevel alone without alerting the surface emergency services was a reckless choice. They are not wrong. But calling the surface would have taken 4 minutes, and I had already assessed from the crack pattern that the secondary settlement window was narrower than 4 minutes if the east face supports were also compromised. The building was telling me what it was going to do. I believed it. I said, "Is anyone in here?" The answer came from the west end. Not words, a sound, brief, controlled, the sound of someone who is managing pain and does not want to announce themselves. I moved toward it, stepping over the debris carefully, keeping my light low to check the floor before each step. I found her in the main stack section, in the southeast corner, sitting on the floor with her back against the far wall, and a section of ceiling panel across her right leg below the knee. She had both hands braced on the floor beside her. Her face was still. Her pale gold eyes tracked my light and then my face without any shift in expression, which was not the expression of someone who was calm. It was the expression of someone who had used up their visible reactions and was now operating on the underneath of things. She had been sitting there in the dark for however long it had been since the detonation, alone in a collapsed archive, with no way to know if anyone was coming. I said quietly, "I'm going to look at the panel, don't move the leg." She said, "I know that." Her compact standard was precise and slightly formal, the way it is when it is a third or fourth language and has been learned academically rather than by use. She did not ask who I was. She did not ask if I was there to help or how I had gotten down or what the situation was above. I was human, and I had a cable light and I had come down. That was what mattered, and she was a person who understood what mattered without needing to ask. The panel section was approximately 1.5 meters of medium-weight composite ceiling plate, which under normal circumstances a person of average build can lift. The problem was not the weight. The problem was that the panel had come down at an angle, and the edge nearest her leg had caught on a fallen stack unit beside her, which meant if I lifted straight up, the panel would pivot on that catch point and the near edge would go down. I needed to shift the stack unit first, and the stack unit was under the panel. I set my cable light on top of a nearby intact unit, angled to give me working light, and I crouched and looked at the geometry of the problem for approximately 90 seconds. She waited. She did not tell me to hurry. She did not make any of the sounds people make when they are frightened and want reassurance. She watched me work out the problem, and she was quiet, and I registered that quality of stillness as something deliberate and hard-won. Not the stillness of someone who was composed, but the stillness of someone who had learned that composure was, under enough circumstances, a survival tool. I said, "I'm going to slide a piece of debris under the panel edge to change the pivot point before I lift. It's going to move. Tell me if the pane changes significantly." She said, "All right." I found a section of door frame in the debris field, approximately 40 centimeters of solid aluminum composite. I positioned it under the panel at the point I needed, tested the angle, adjusted it 2 centimeters, and then I lifted. The panel shifted, the pivot point transferred to the door frame section, and the near edge came up rather than down. I set the panel against the wall. Her leg was bruised, possibly cracked at the fibula, swollen along the outer edge, tender to a careful touch, but the angle was not broken and the circulation was not compromised. Not a crushing injury, painful and limiting but ambulatory if she had support. I said, "Can you put weight on it?" She said, "I will be able to." I said, "Give it a minute." She said, "I know that too." I sat back on my heels and looked at the ceiling above us. The secondary groan I had heard from above was 11 minutes old now, which meant the building had settled somewhat. The question was whether it had settled into a stable configuration or an intermediate one. Intermediate means more movement is coming, the structure is redistributing load, and has not found its new resting geometry. Stable means what it sounds like. The fracture pattern I had seen on sublevel 2 ran east to west, and the column failure here was at the west end of sublevel 3, which meant the west face of the building had taken the primary structural damage. The east face should be the better supported side. We needed to go east. I said, "The stairwell is at the north end of the east corridor. The east corridor's ceiling looked intact from the stairwell entrance. That's our route." She said, "The stairwell door was sealed when I checked it from this side." I said, "It wasn't sealed, it was buckled. I opened it." She looked at me for a moment with those pale gold eyes and said, "You came down through a compromised stairwell." I said, "Yes." She did not say anything to that. She began, very carefully, to gather herself to stand. I helped her up. She accepted this without comment, which is a specific kind of unself-consciousness that I have noticed in people who have spent a lot of time having to accept assistance they did not want in circumstances they did not choose. She put her right arm across my shoulders, and I took her weight on my left side, and we stood together in the corner of the collapsed deep archive at 21:56 in the evening, and she smelled of composite dust and something clean underneath, and the cable light through our shadows long and crooked across the fallen stacks. I said, "Ready?" She said, "Yes." We started east. The first part was slow because I needed to check the corridor ceiling as we moved, and checking a ceiling properly requires stopping and looking, which required her to stop and balance, which she did without complaint. She was a careful mover, even injured. She watched where she was placing her good foot. She adjusted her weight on my shoulder when the terrain required it. She did not rush me when I stopped. She understood what I was doing and why. I noted the fracture patterns as we went, building a model in my head of where the load was sitting and what was likely to shift next. The east corridor was, as I had assessed from above, structurally better than the west. The ceiling panels were intact, the floor was level, and the emergency strips here were still functioning in a dim, intermittent way that gave us at least a sense of the space ahead. We were approximately 30 meters from the stairwell when the lights went out entirely. Not a flicker, not a gradual fade, a clean cut, which meant the building's secondary power had failed rather than degraded. Secondary power failure usually means a substation problem in the power routing, which in a building that has just had a structural device detonated somewhere in its foundation load path, means the device was more comprehensive in its design than a single column failure. I noted that and did not say it aloud. The sublevel was completely dark. I stopped. I kept my arm around her. I said quietly, "Don't move. I've got the cable light." I found it with my right hand. It was clipped to my survey kit, which was on my right shoulder, and I was reaching to unclip it when the light source changed. It was coming from her. I had read about Velorath, the way you read about things when you are on a joint compact campus, and you are trying to understand the alien cultures around you. It is a bioluminescent trait that occurs in a small percentage of the Velorath bloodline, a network of subcutaneous photophores that activate under specific physiological conditions, including acute stress and complete darkness. The academic literature describes it as a biological vestige, similar in principle to deepwater luminescent organisms in human marine biology, likely a lineage adaptation to low-light environments in the Velorath system's earlier history. The political literature I had also found, because I had wondered why an apparent third-daughter exchange student moved like someone trying not to be seen, described Velorath as a mark of instability, a social deficit. The kind of thing that makes a royal daughter difficult to place in a succession registry, and easier to remove from court visibility, by sending her to a joint compact university on a frontier posting planet. What she was in that dark corridor was the reason we could see. She was lit from within along the line of her jaw and down the column of her throat, across her collarbones, faintly along her forearms and the backs of her hands. The light was cool blue-green, steady, not harsh, the same quality as deep-sea bioluminescence, which I had seen once on a survey posting with my father off the Keth coast, that particular living glow that is not interested in being looked at but simply is. It was not bright. In full light it would have been invisible or nearly so, a subtle shimmer under the surface of her skin. In a collapsed sublevel at zero ambient illumination, it was enough. I could see the floor. I could see the ceiling. I could see the walls to either side and the debris pattern ahead, and enough of the ceiling to make structural judgments about what we were moving under. I still unclipped my cable light because even poor equipment redundancy is better than none, but I held it rather than turning it on. I looked at her and she looked at me, and neither of us said anything about what had just happened. There was nothing to say that was useful. What she was producing was exactly what we needed, and the time to discuss it was not now. We kept moving. She spoke as we walked. Not constantly, not nervously. She spoke in the way that people sometimes do when they have been alone with a bad situation for a while, and the act of speech is itself a kind of organizing force, a way of confirming that things are real and ordered rather than collapsed. She told me her name. I told her mine. She said she had noticed me in the sublevel corridor on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, and that I always had a rock sample in my coat pocket, and I said I usually did, yes. She said she had been coming to the Deep Archive for 3 months because it was the only part of the campus where the court attendant assigned to her did not follow her. The attendant's access clearance did not include the archive level. She said the attendant was not there for her comfort. I said I had figured that. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "The device was placed in the juncture column at sublevel 3's west end. It would not have been placed there by someone who did not know the building's load-bearing structure." I said no, someone ran a structural analysis before placing it. The column choice was precise. She said, "I am the third daughter of the Velorath ruling house. There are people who would prefer I not return from this exchange posting." I said, "Are you telling me this so I know what I'm walking into, or for some other reason?" She said both. I said, "All right." She said, "That's all." I said, "I'm a geology student. I can't do anything about whatever is happening at the political level." What I can do is get you out of this building, so that's what I'm going to do." She did not respond to that immediately. We moved another 10 meters in the bioluminescent light, her arm across my shoulders and my hand at her side, and the cable light hanging unlit from my right hand. The light from her jaw and throat and forearms was steady and practical, and it occurred to me that the court had spent years using this trait as evidence of her unsuitability, and it was, at this specific moment, the most useful thing in the sublevel. Then she said, "No one has ever said that to me before." I said what? She said, that the thing they can do is the thing they will do, without the context around it. Without the explanation of what they cannot do, or the reassurance that they wish they could do more, or the apology for the limits of their position. Just, "This is the thing, and I will do it." I did not know what to say to that, so I did not say anything. I checked the ceiling at the next panel joint, found it solid, and kept us moving. The stairwell door was where I had left it, buckled frame, disengaged lock. I got it open again, got her through the frame carefully so her right leg did not catch on the lower edge, and we started up the stairs. The stairs were harder than the corridor because they required her to bear full weight on the right leg for each step, and even with my support, each step produced a controlled, brief tightening of her jaw. She did not make any other sound. She counted the steps under her breath, which I recognized as a pain management technique, giving the mind a number to track instead of a sensation to endure. We had 19 steps. She counted them all. At the top of the stairwell, I got the sublevel 2 door open. The building had shifted again in the past 40 minutes, and it required more force than before, which told me the settling was not complete, which told me we needed to keep moving, and we came out into the survey lab. The lab was in better condition than the archive had been. One bench was overturned, 2 ceiling panels had come down, but the structural elements were intact. My sample reader was on the floor where it had fallen, the sample intact in its housing. I noted it and did not stop. I could hear distantly the sound of emergency vehicles outside. I looked at my survey kit watch, 22:31, 44 minutes since the detonation. I said, "Emergency access is through the north stairwell to sublevel 1, then the main corridor to the north entrance. That's the fastest route out." She said, "The court delegation will be at the north entrance." I stopped. I looked at her. She said, "They monitor my location through the campus access system. They will have seen my last logged entry point as the deep archive, and they will have responded to the detonation. They will be at the primary access points." I said, "Who specifically?" She said, "The delegation head is Preen Velsorvain Koren. He filed the exchange placement documentation. He also holds an active administrative mandate to manage any event that creates a public record involving a member of the royal house." I said, "Which this would?" She said, "Which this would. A structural incident at a joint compact academic facility with royal house involvement would generate a mandatory exchange protocol record. Under that record, the unauthorized royal contact provision can be invoked against any person found present with an unsupervised royal house member during such an incident. Against you. And the incident record itself can be used to support a formal recommendation for early exchange termination, meaning my early departure from this posting." I said, "Filed by him." She said, "Initiated by him. He has the delegated authority to do it without consulting my mother directly, provided the record is established quickly. Speed is the instrument." I said, "What happens if you file first?" She was quiet for longer than I had been. The bioluminescence had faded somewhat as we had come back into the dim ambient light of the survey lab. It was still visible at her jaw and throat, a pale pulse, but quieter now. She was looking at me with those pale gold eyes, and whatever she was measuring it carefully. I had the sense that she was deciding something, not just calculating it. She said, If I file a Velorath Acknowledged Presence form, which is a sovereign registry action, compact recognized, and cannot be overridden by a delegation administrative mandate, before Corin files the incident report, the authorization window for the unauthorized contact provision closes. You would be named in the Velorath record as an acknowledged person. His instrument disappears. I said, and for you? She said, a Velorath filing from a royal house member is a public record. It cannot be used to support an exchange termination recommendation. It would need to be contested at the sovereign level, which Corin does not have the standing to initiate alone. He would need my mother's directive. And my mother has not given it. I said, so it protects you too. She said, in a limited sense. It does not resolve the larger situation, but it closes the immediate instrument and puts the record in the public domain before he can manage what goes into it. I said, then let's do that. She said, you understand what the Velorath form is, what it designates. I said, I read the Velorath exchange documentation when I started the semester. The Velorath is an acknowledged presence registration. It means you've seen someone and named them in the sovereign record. She said, in the formal version it means more than that. I said, then explain it to me. She said, the formal Velorath is a life partner designation. It is Velorath's oldest sovereign registry form. It has legal standing in 14 compact systems. It designates the named person as the registrant's chosen person, formally, permanently, and publicly. It was designed before the current court structures existed for exactly the circumstance of a sovereign naming a person they had decided to keep, regardless of whether the court agreed. I was quiet for a moment. I said, you're saying the form you're describing is a marriage registration. She said, in compact standard terminology, approximately yes. I said, and you're suggesting filing it, now for me. She said, I am asking if you consent to that. The survey lab was quiet around us. The distant sound of emergency vehicles had gotten closer. The pale bioluminescence at her jaw pulsed once, gently and steadied. I thought about what she had said in the corridor. The thing they can do is the thing they will do, without the context around it. I thought about 3 months of watching her make herself small in the corridors of a campus she had not chosen, timed to the movement of a court attendant who was there as a management tool rather than a courtesy. I thought about Velorath described as a deficit in every piece of political literature I had found, and what it had looked like in an utterly dark sublevel at 2200. The reason we had been able to see, the reason we had been able to move, the thing that her own court had spent years calling her liability, and which had, specifically and practically, helped keep us both alive. I thought about a woman who counted steps under her breath and waited for me to work out a geometry problem, and did not make any of the sounds that would have been understandable, and simply was the kind of person she was. I said yes. She looked at me for a moment. She said, you don't hesitate much. I said, I hesitate when there's a reason to. There isn't one. She said, I need to file the form verbally in front of witnesses. The north entrance will have the court delegation, which constitutes official Velorath witnesses, and the emergency response teams, which constitute compact witnesses. I said, then that's where we go. I gave her the water canteen first. She drank from it without formality and handed it back, and I put it in my kit. I turned the cable light on. She straightened as much as her leg permitted, and I felt her gather herself, not performing, not staging, simply deciding to be the person she was when she walked into rooms that mattered. Third daughter or not, she was Velorath ruling house, and the bearing she had spent her whole campus placement trying to minimize came back to her naturally, and without effort, the way anything comes back that was always actually there. I offered her my arm, she took it, we went up. The north entrance opened onto the emergency courtyard, which was lit by the sweep of 3 response team vehicles, and the pale pre-dawn gray of a sky beginning to shift from black to dark blue. The vehicles were at the south end of the courtyard. The court delegation was at the north, 4 people, formally dressed, which meant they had been in transit already when the detonation happened, which meant the timing had not been an accident of our schedule but of theirs. Preen Velsorvain Koren was in front, a tall figure in formal Velsorvain court attire, dark gray and gold, moving with the purpose of someone who has been in position for this moment and knows what order the next actions need to happen in. He had a document case under his arm. He was already moving toward the entrance as we came through it. He stopped when he saw her. I think he expected to see her alone, or not at all. I think the third possibility, that she would be standing upright, bioluminescent at the jaw and throat in the pre-dawn light, her arm through a human student's arm, her bearing absolutely composed, had not been in his operational plan. He said, "Princess Velsorvain, we have been." She said, "I know." Her voice in that courtyard was entirely different from the voice she had used in the corridor, not louder, clearer. The precision was the same, but the register had changed. There was nothing small about it. There was nothing that made itself smaller for the convenience of the space. She said, "Preen Velsorvain Koren, delegation head, I am filing a Velorath acknowledged presence designation, formal registry class, effective immediately, witnessed by the Velsorvain court delegation present and the compact emergency response personnel present." Koren said, "Princess, the incident protocol requires." She said, "The Velorath filing supersedes the incident protocol under Velsorvain Compact Exchange Section 7, Subsection 4. You know this." He stopped. His hand tightened on the document case. He did not say anything. The courtyard was quiet for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. She turned to me. She was still holding my arm, and she looked at me with those pale gold eyes and the bioluminescence still at her jaw, and she said, "Dove and Kale. I have seen you, I name you, I will not set you aside." The courtyard was quiet. One of the emergency response team members, a compact officer, middle-aged, a woman with short gray hair and a field pad in her hand, looked up from what she had been writing and said to me quietly, "She's filing a formal Velorath. You're being named as her designated life partner in the Velsorvain Sovereign Registry. This is legally binding in 14 compact systems. Do you consent?" I said yes. The officer said, "Noted," and went back to her pad. Koren said, "This is irregular." She said, "It is the oldest registry form in Velsorvain law. It is not irregular. It is prior to every procedure you are carrying in that case, and it is now on the public record." He stood for a moment in the pre-dawn light with his document case, and whatever calculations he was running, I could see them reaching their results in his face. A Velorath filing in front of compact witnesses was not a thing you could manage out of a public record with a delegation mandate. It would have to go to the sovereign level. It would require her mother's direct involvement. He did not have the standing to initiate that alone, and he knew it. He said, "Your mother will." She said, "My mother will receive the record. What she does with it is her decision, not yours. Your mandate ends here." He did not say anything else. The delegation stood in the courtyard, and the response teams moved around them with the efficient practicality of people who have work to do regardless of what is happening in the political foreground. After a moment, Koren turned and spoke quietly to the 3 people behind him, and they withdrew toward the north end of the courtyard to a position that was technically still present, but was not, in any meaningful sense, still engaged. The compact officer came to us and said, "We need to get you both to medical. The princess needs imaging on that leg." She said, "Yes." She looked at me. She said, "Can you walk without?" I said, "I'm fine." "Come on." We walked across the emergency courtyard together, her hand still in my arm, the bioluminescence fading now as the pre-dawn light strengthened around us, replaced by ordinary gray morning and the smell of composite dust, and the distant sound of response equipment working on the building behind us. Behind me, Corin stood with his document case and did not move toward the entrance. I did not look back. The medical station was set up at the south end of the courtyard, 2 portable units with a compact medic who assessed her leg efficiently and told her what I had told her: fibula bruise, possibly a hairline, imaging required, and then looked at me and said I should sit down, which I did, because I found when I actually sat down that my legs had opinions about the past hour that they had been politely deferring until now. She was in the adjacent unit, visible through the open partition. The medic had her leg immobilized and was running a scanner. She was sitting straight, answering the medic's questions, and every few minutes she glanced across at me, not checking whether I was still there exactly, something more like confirming a calculation. Like she was working through something, and the variable she needed to verify was me, not my presence, but the quality of it. Whether the person she had named in the courtyard was the same person he had been in the sublevel, now that the sublevel was behind them and the morning was here. I sat with my survey kit on my knees and my cable light coiled in my lap, and I thought about what had just happened. Not the rescue, which had simply been a sequence of structural problems and their solutions, each one addressable by the same methods I used for any structural assessment: observe, model, choose the path with the most favorable load distribution. The part after. The courtyard and the Velorath, and the way she had said my name in front of a court delegation and an emergency response team on the record. The gray-haired compact officer came to me and said, "The filing is confirmed in the Velorath Sovereign Registry and the Compact Joint Compact Exchange record. You'll receive documentation. I'd recommend reading it carefully and talking to the Compact Exchange office about what it entails practically." I said, "Thank you." She said, "She's a third daughter. It's a complicated position. I'm not trying to tell you what to think about this. I'm just saying the documentation is worth reading." I said, "I will." She said, "You did good work tonight. That was a deliberate device placement. The structural engineering faculty will want to talk to you about your assessment of the failure pattern." I said, "I know." She moved on. Across the partition, the medic was finishing the scanner pass. She Vithai. I kept reminding myself to use her name in my own head, that she was not the princess, or the alien student, or any of the categories that had collected around her over the past 3 months. Vithai caught my eye across the partition and held it for a moment. She did not smile. She did not make any of the social gestures that the situation might have called for. She simply looked at me with the same quality of attention she had used in the corridor, steady and complete, the attention of someone who was still assessing, and had decided she was satisfied with what she was finding. Then she looked back at the medic. That was enough. I knew what it meant, or I was beginning to. I had come down into the sublevel because she was there, and the building was failing, and those were the 2 facts that mattered. I had not thought further than that in the moment, because you cannot think further than the immediate problem when you are inside it. But the thing she had said in the corridor had stayed with me through the courtyard and the filing and the medical station, working its way into the framework of the evening, the way something fits into a structure when the load path is right. No one has ever told me that the thing they can do is the thing they will do, without the context around it. I am 22 years old. I am a geology student at a joint compact university on a frontier posting planet. My parents are compact survey division people, frontier postings, joint compact stations, the kind of work where what you know is more important than your title, and where showing up is understood as the basic minimum and not as something exceptional. I was raised to read structures honestly and report what I found, and not embellish the result in either direction. I was raised to do the job that was in front of me. My most significant achievement prior to tonight was a first-place finish in the intercampus structural survey competition in my 2nd term, which is the sort of thing that impresses geology faculty and nobody else. I have no standing in the Velorath court, no rank in any hierarchy, no political weight anywhere. I had come down with a cable light and a survey kit, and the knowledge that composite ceilings fail at a rate that tells you whether you have time. But I had been in the right place to know what a crack propagating too fast across a ceiling meant, and I had stayed still when running would have been the wrong choice, and I had gone down because she was down there and I could. My father would have called that the job. My mother would have called it obvious. They would both be right, and I did not think either of them would be wrong about what I was going to do next either. The Velorath documentation arrived on my field pad at 0517. I read it in full, the way the officer had recommended, all 4 sections and the appendices. The formal Velorath was, as Vithai had said, a life partner designation, comprehensive, public, legally recognized across 14 compact systems, intended to be permanent, terminable only by mutual sovereign registry filing. It had been designed, the documentation noted before the current court structures existed, as a mechanism by which a Velorath sovereign could name a chosen person regardless of court approval. It was older than the succession protocols Corin had been carrying in his document case. It was prior to all of it. The documentation also noted, in a smaller section at the end, that the Velorath registration created a mutual designation. It was not unilateral. The designated person had the right to file a response acknowledgement, which would complete the registration as a mutual record, or to file a termination notice, which would close it. Filing neither left the registration in a pending state for 90 days before it lapsed. I sat with my cable light in my lap, and the dawn coming fully over the emergency courtyard and the campus buildings beyond it, and the structural engineering faculty was going to want to talk to me about the device placement, and Professor Orenth was going to want to know where my compressive stress samples were, and there was a full semester of coursework between me and the end of my exchange posting. None of that was the thing I was thinking about. I opened the response acknowledgement field on my pad. I thought about 3 months of corridor sightings and a court attendant who was not there for her benefit and a deep archive that was the only quiet place on campus. I thought about Velorath described as a deficit and used as the only light in a dark sublevel. I thought about no one has ever told me that the thing they can do is the thing they will do, and I have seen you, I name you, I will not set you aside. I filled out the response acknowledgement, I read it over once, I filed it. The timestamp was 0524. Vithai came out of the medical unit at 0531, moving on a temporary support brace, with the medic's instructions in hand. She crossed the courtyard to where I was sitting, and she looked at my field pad, which I was holding face up, and she saw the acknowledgement confirmation on the screen. She sat down beside me. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "You read the full documentation?" I said, "Yes." She said, "The acknowledgement is not required. The Velorath is binding on its own. The acknowledgement is." I said, "I know what it is." She was quiet. I said, "I read carefully." She said, "I know. I've watched you in the survey lab." I did not say anything to that. She said, "I want to tell you that I did not file the Velorath only as an instrument. I want to be clear about that." I said, "I know." She said, "You knew before I told you." I said, "In the corridor when you asked if I consented, the way you asked, if it had been only an instrument you would have explained the instrument first. You explained what it meant first." She was quiet. I said, "I don't know what comes next. I don't know what your mother will say or the court, or what the political situation looks like from your side of it. I'm a geology student on a 1-year exchange posting. My working knowledge of Velorath sovereign law is approximately 40 pages of exchange documentation, and whatever I can find in the archive, which I will note I now intend to read considerably more carefully." She said, "That is considerably more than most people make the effort to find." I said, It seemed like important context. She said, "It is." I said, "So I don't know what next year looks like or the year after. What I know is what I can do. And what I can do is read carefully and learn what I don't know and be the person who shows up." She looked at me. The morning light was full now, gray gold and clean, and the bioluminescence was gone, and she was just a woman sitting beside me on a bench outside a medical station with a support brace on her right leg, and her indigo hair carrying composite dust from a collapsed sublevel. She was the most particular and specific person I had seen in 3 months on this campus, and she was looking at me with those pale gold eyes in a way that required me to hold very still. She said, "That is what I was hoping you would say." I said, "Good." She said, "The structural engineering faculty will want to speak with you this morning." I said, "I know." She said, "And I will need to place a call to my mother before the delegation reaches her first." I said, "That seems wise." She said, "After that I have no appointment until 1400. I said, "I have a makeup lab session I technically still need to finish. The compressive stress samples are still in the survey lab." She said, "If the survey lab is accessible." I said, "Probably not before noon. The structural team will need to clear it first." She said, "Then you have time." I said, "For what?" She said, "I would like to sit here until the sun is fully up. I have not watched a sunrise from this campus. I have been, for 3 months, on a schedule designed by someone else." I said, "That sounds reasonable and correct." We sat there. The morning came in over the campus buildings, over the emergency vehicles still parked at the south end of the courtyard, over the north entrance through which we had walked an hour ago. The court delegation was gone. I had not seen them leave, but the north end of the courtyard was empty now, and Corin's document case was not in evidence anywhere. The compact officer was filing reports at one of the response vehicles. The medic was breaking down one of the portable units. The campus was beginning to wake, distant voices and transit sounds starting up somewhere above us. I thought about the Velorath documentation in my field pad, and what 14 compact systems meant, and what a second-year geology student was going to do with a life partner registration in the Velorath Sovereign Registry. I thought about 40 pages of exchange documentation, and the deep archive and Tuesday and Thursday evenings and pale gold eyes that registered everything. I thought, learn what I don't know and show up. That is what I can do. That is enough to start with. Beside me, Vithai shifted the support brace slightly, found a more comfortable angle and settled. Her shoulder was near mine, not touching, just near. The sun came up. I stayed.